It's my pleasure today to introduce someone who is clearly no stranger to Oregon. She is Dr. Christine Cassel, and she has spent a number of years here in Oregon teaching at the Oregon Health Sciences University and working at the Veterans Administration Medical Center. She is the chief of the section of General Internal Medicine and Associate Professor of Medicine of Public Policy at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. She is also president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, an activity that she says is near and dear to her heart. Reading her resume is probably one of the most impressive things that I've ever done, and it's fascinating to meet somebody with as many and different interests. And I will just read one sentence that describes some of her professional activities. She is actively involved in policy-relevant research. Most currently, this work centers on demographic and epidemiologic, I knew I was going to blow that word, on epidemiologic, thank you, forecasting on social concepts of successful aging and on the role of physicians in political issues. She's here today, however, not to speak about her work, but to talk about Physicians for Social Responsibility. This is a national organization with more than 50,000 members in 49 states and 150 chapters. It is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization which works to educate medical professionals and the public about the medical hazards of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. The organization works to effect the halt of the arms race and for the eradication of the threat of nuclear war. Will you help me welcome, speaking about the Physicians for Social Responsibility, Dr. Christine Cassel.
Thank you. It is a pleasure, always a pleasure to come back to Portland and see friends here and this beautiful part of the country. But it's also particularly a pleasure to be able to talk with you today about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart, and this work that I do with the Physicians for Social Responsibility, partly because my work with this organization began in Portland, and so it has that special significance as well. What I've been asked to do today is to review with you briefly the history of this organization, something about its work, its successes, and its goals for the future. And so I will try to do that and then welcome your questions. Many people don't realize that PSR was started a long time ago, actually in 1961, at the time that we, the United States, was engaged in atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. Very little was understood, either by the public or by the medical profession at that time, about the health hazards of radioactivity. And the phenomenon of radioactive fallout was a new thing that people were just learning about. A group of dentists, and we really have to give credit to the correct group of professionals here, a group of dentists in the Midwest began collecting deciduous teeth of children, baby teeth that had fallen out, and analyzing them for radioactive isotopes, and they found a number of long-lived radioactive isotopes in the teeth of these children and began to realize that these isotopes, these elements, were getting into not only the children's teeth but into their bones, and that this could be, over the long range or even the medium range, detrimental to their health. They began to trace the pattern of this occurrence and see that it was related directly to the fallout from these nuclear weapons tests that were occurring in Nevada at the time, and very quickly began a public education campaign to talk to parents as well as to policymakers about the risks that were being posed to public health from this atmospheric testing. Within a very short period of time, less than a year really, it went from a public education campaign to a concern of the national administration, and President Kennedy, who was president at that time, appointed Averell Harriman to go to Moscow and negotiate a test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. And that treaty was completed within a couple of weeks. Not years, but weeks. An example of how when the political will exists, a treaty really can be confirmed on both sides and completed. It was not, as we had hoped, and even as President Kennedy had hoped, a comprehensive test ban treaty, which might then have stopped modernization of nuclear weapons and the arms race that as we see it today. But it was a limited test ban treaty, banning nuclear weapons tests from the atmosphere and sending them both literally and figuratively underground. Then, during the next decade, we, like most Americans, more or less forgot about the threat of nuclear war, forgot about the ongoing tests underground, and forgot about the dramatically growing arsenals of nuclear weapons. In 1979 and 1980, we reawoke to this phenomenon, and a number of reasons made this a number of things sort of conspired to make this happen. One of them was that we were getting also nervous about the threat to health of nuclear energy. 3 Mile Island happened in 1979, you may recall. And in addition to that, we had a new administration in 1980 that was very adamant about the threat of the Soviet Union and the need to build up even further our nuclear weapons arsenals, and I think more importantly, began to talk about actually using nuclear weapons, fighting and winning a war with them, which was something that Americans had never really thought about before. They'd always sort of assumed that there was sort of deterrence and these weapons were kept somewhere, but of course would never be used. And I remember actually at the time talking with a 16-year-old son of a friend of mine after we had seen a film about nuclear weapons tests with footage of mushroom clouds in it. And he asked us, he said, were those really real? I always thought those were cartoons. So we had high school students in the United States who really didn't understand anything about this particular military threat, not only to the rest of the world, but also to them. So it was a naive period that we entered into at this time, and the Physicians for Social Responsibility began conducting its own research and public education program. The public education program centered on a couple of basic precepts. The precepts were that nuclear weapons are qualitatively different than other kinds of weapons, and so hugely and unimaginably destructive that you couldn't win a war with them. That the damage that they would cause, not only to human beings, but to all of the earth, and that damage would extend even beyond the areas in which they were used, meant that anybody who thought that they could fight a war with these weapons was kidding themselves. They were suicidal and omnicidal. We began to sponsor research about the effects on human beings of the actual use of these weapons and the effects on the environment. And new scientific evidence began to come to light about effects on the ozone layer, nuclear winter, things that really hadn't been widely understood before, which, as an aside, I think is an interesting fact. We'd had these weapons around for 40 years, and it never occurred to any of the scientists looking into it that there would be fires after a nuclear war. That was really the fundamental discovery of the nuclear winter model, was that there would be massive fires and what would all this smoke do. And it was actually Mount St. Helens that was used as a model for how that particulate matter would remain suspended in the air and interrupt the warming rays of the sun. So this was a sort of a new boldness, if you will, of actually looking this horrible stuff in the face. I think that it was all those decades before a sort of denial about what was going on and a buying into the model that more is better and we just need more. So in the early 1980s, in this climate, we began to deliver this message to the public at large, and that was when I got involved in this. I was living in Portland at the time. I went to San Francisco to attend a symposium, a medical symposium entitled The Medical Consequences of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear War. And I didn't know much about it at the time, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that's about. And also, it's always nice to have an excuse to go to San Francisco and for a medical meeting, so I went and sat through 2 days of some of the most devastating scientific presentations that I have ever heard and imagine I ever will hear in my life. And I walked out of that auditorium, came back to Portland, and said, where is this organization, PSR? I have to join. As it happened, Karen Shteyngart, a physician here in your community, had started what was then a very small chapter of physicians starting to educate themselves and do this work here. I joined, as did, as it turned out, hundreds and thousands of other physicians during those years, and to this day continue to work with this group. So that phenomenon was duplicated all over the country, and it had simply to do with the power of the facts, the power of the data that was being presented to us. And I think to this day, that's part of our credibility on this issue, is that we do have a healthy respect for facts. When we get into a new arena, we always make sure to educate ourselves about it, to look into many sides of an argument, and to rely on experts in certain areas if we aren't ourselves experts in that area. Because the American public had not heard this message before, and because by and large in 1979 most people thought nuclear war would never happen here, number one, and number two, if it did, they could just go down in the basement and hide for a couple days and it would blow over. And that really is true. There was a remarkable lack of education and public opinion in the United States at that time. This was news, and it hit the newspapers and the press. It got lots of attention, people started making movies about what it would be like after a nuclear war and television shows. And there was a dramatic increase in both the level of understanding of the American public about the threat that these weapons posed, and also their level of anxiety about it. And as you may know, some of our members have studied the effects on children and the psychological effects of living with the knowledge that there may be no future. The fact that high school students you talk to these days often say, well, if I grow up, I want to be such and such, rather than when I grow up. And that's really something that we need to take responsibility for as a civilization, and to provide, if we can, a real future for those kids. All of those things combined then led to a dramatic growth of this organization from just a few hundred people in the late 70s to 20,000 people by 1982, and to our current membership of almost 50,000, of whom about 37,000 are physicians. 1 out of every 10 American doctors belongs to PSR, and we are currently the 11th largest national medical organization listed with the AMA. So it's not a small fringe organization anymore. It's a mainstream, stable membership organization of physicians and other health professionals working for the prevention of nuclear war. Now, having educated the public in the United States about all of this terrible news, what we call the bombing run or the doom and gloom talk, we felt that that wasn't enough. You can't just make a diagnosis, particularly a terminal diagnosis, without also offering a prescription, without also empowering people to do something about it. And so we began educating ourselves about 2 different ways of looking at that. One has to do with arms control, and with beginning to support specific legislation, such as a comprehensive test ban, the proposed START treaty, the INF treaty, reductions in emphasis on technological solutions that won't work, such as SDI, et cetera. And many different groups of PSR became very knowledgeable about these different kinds of arms control measures. Another thing that we did was to look at the root of the conflict and begin to explore conflict resolution and also international understanding. And even before glasnost and perestroika were brought to us by Gorbachev, we began to sponsor exchanges between physicians from the Soviet Union and from the United States. And we joined with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is an international federation of groups based on the same model of PSR, which now exist in more than 60 countries all over the world, have groups of doctors which share this concern, which meet at a Congress every year that happens in a different city everywhere in the world, and in which the Eastern Bloc countries play a major role. So this was a very important model, and so important in those days that it led to our receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 for that work. Having now seen this change in public opinion, which I think really is one of the most dramatic things if you look back over the last decade, we've also begun to see some concrete progress in this area, and I think that we, as well as other groups working in this arena, need to take credit for this. One is the shift in Congress about opinions about nuclear weapons particularly, and the relative importance of military spending for our security, and that's something I want to get into in just a minute. Progressively over the last 10 years, at every 2-year congressional election, more and more people have come into Congress who basically agree that we don't need nuclear weapons, that they don't make us more secure, and that they only pose a greater and greater threat to the world. And so that's a very important thing to point out. Secondly, even the Reagan administration, which had been initially the most both hostile to our point of view and also adamantly in favor of buildup of nuclear weapons and using nuclear weapons. I mean, these sort of offhand remarks about the bombing starts in 5 minutes, and I remember Secretary Haig's proposal that we pop off a test explosion over the Indian Ocean just to show them that we're serious, and those kinds of discussions lost their favor with the public very quickly, right around 1984-85. And instead, what began to happen is that even President Reagan realized that what the public wanted was arms control, was a reduction in these growing arsenals, and responded to that with the INF Treaty. Of course, the other major change that had occurred was that the Soviet government had now a leader who realized the same thing, that nobody was getting any military advantage out of this arms race. It was destroying both of our economies, and it was just a dumb idea, and there had to be some way of breaking through that. So the INF Treaty, which was signed in December of 1987 and then ratified later in 1988, was a very important historic event. It's the first time in the history of the world that we've ever agreed with the Soviets to get rid of a whole class of nuclear weapons. So that's a very important first step, psychologically if nothing else, because we woke up the next morning and felt no less secure, probably even felt a little more secure. But you must remember that from the time that treaty was signed in December of 1987 until now, we have produced more than twice as many weapons as will be dismantled under the 3 years of the INF Treaty. So that the momentum of the arms race continues, and our work is only just beginning in that sense. We can't look at the INF Treaty as anything more than a tiny beginning. Both President Reagan and now President Bush are talking about a START treaty, which is to reduce arsenals by 50%, something that would have been unthinkable just 5 or 6 years ago. So that gives you some sense of how the tenor of opinion has changed in this country. So we need to keep informed about those realities and about how they change. We also need to understand that even a START treaty, even reducing arsenals by 50%, doesn't create any greater safety if it doesn't stop the momentum of modernization and the development of new and more dangerous weapons that have both a very short lead time and also are largely controlled by computers. And that more modern these weapons become, the more dangerous they become. And the test ban is really the only strategy that can prevent that from continuing. Now, having said that, and having celebrated, as we did with many other people, the INF Treaty and its importance, we look to our organization and say, well, what do we do now? Many of the so-called peace groups or disarmament groups in Washington are finding that they're having trouble fundraising these days. People are figuring, oh, we've solved this problem now. They're not so scared as they used to be. They're moving on to other interests. They're concerned about the environment, goodness knows. They're concerned about education, about drugs, about crime, about gun control, whatever it is, and less concerned about the threat of nuclear war, even though strictly speaking, that threat continues to grow in the same way, and particularly when you look at horizontal proliferation to other countries in the world, gets more and more scary all the time. But, you know, Americans have a short attention span, and those of us who are trying in nonprofit organizations and public interest organizations to raise money and get attention from our leaders have a constant struggle of how to make it new and different and somehow get more attention from them. But interestingly enough, PSR has not had this same fall off in either our funding or our membership. I think that there's more of a sense at least among the physician membership, that this is a stable commitment to an organization that's dealing with a problem that's going to be with us over the long haul, and that it's going to take the rest of our lives to continue to work on this. And we have to therefore integrate it in with our professional and personal lives in a way that we don't get either burnt out or distracted by other things. And so for that reason, I'm particularly proud of this organization right now and privileged to be its president. We do realize, however, that it's time to look at a more positive message, a more positive vision. What we've been doing for the last 10 years is responding to things that we thought were a bad idea, telling you what happens to you if a nuclear weapon explodes over Portland, telling you what all of the weapon systems we're against and why we're against them, and basically a very sort of negative responding mode. What we want to do now is look at a vision of the future, combine the political reality of having to say no to a number of very specific things with a vision for what should the United States be doing about its national security, number one, and more importantly, how do we define that national security? And that's really the effort that we're currently involved in, and we call that our new vision of national security. It's not something that we made up or that is really even unique to us. During the last election campaigns, we heard a lot about the fact that everyone realizes that more nuclear weapons do not make us more secure. So that's the fundamental premise on which this is based. And if that is true, then what does national security consist of in the 1990s and beyond? Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which was widely read and discussed in Washington, describes how in history many different civilizations have been destroyed by an overemphasis on military and an underemphasis on their own infrastructure and economic productivity. And what we're seeing in this country is exactly that happening. And so when we think about national security now, we think of it at least as much in terms of the health of our public and the economic productivity of our citizens as we do in military terms. It may be that nuclear weapons themselves make it impossible to have another world war in the way that we did in the olden days, and so that world domination on the one hand or leadership on the other hand, both the negative and positive views of the same thing, may not be a military quantity anymore. It may not be that the country with the most weapons has the most leadership. It may be that the country with the strongest economy is now going to have the most leadership. And if that's true, the United States is losing that war. And so we have to really examine how these priorities affect us. The standard way we've thought about this is the guns and butter argument. If we spend $1 trillion on weapons, how many jobs does it get us? How could we spend that money better on health care, on education, on transportation, on housing, on almost anything else? And I'm sure all of you have heard how those arguments go. The amounts of money that we have invested in the military in general and in nuclear weapons in particular over the last 8 years is truly an obscene number, particularly at a time when we're seeing cutbacks in every other aspect of our society. But it's not just the guns and butter argument, because as you well know, people can always say, well, even if we didn't spend it on those weapons, who's to say that we would spend it on something that you or I might think is preferable? But there's another effect, and that's the intrinsic effect that overemphasis on military R&D, research and development, has on our economic productivity and our industrial base. That if we devote not only dollars, but the minds of our best scientists and engineers to developing weapons whose only value is if they're never used, instead of developing things that can be competitively bought and sold on the global market, then we are losing out. The best way I can think of to demonstrate that is to ask how many people in the audience, for example, own a VCR. Can I see a show of hands? This audience, about half. And how many people own a Pershing missile? That's what we make in America, and we're very good at it, you know. But what does it do for our economy to put all of our best brains of our scientists and engineers into that kind of development? So that's really what we're looking at now. We're looking at a shift in the economy. We're looking at a negative balance of trade. We're looking at more and more foreign goods being sold successfully in the United States while we're not able to compete on that same international market. Secondly, security is no longer a zero-sum game. It's no longer the case, if it ever was, I don't know, that we become more secure by making the other guy less secure. Nuclear weapons have made that impossible. I mean, there used to be an idea that we would destroy the Soviet Union by forcing them into a competitive arms race that would destroy their economy, and then they would be on their knees. But what can you imagine would be more dangerous than a desperate, poverty-stricken superpower with thousands of nuclear weapons? I mean, that doesn't make me feel more secure. And in fact, if we even look at the rest of the world, at the developing nations, and at the degree to which they continue to fall deeper and deeper into desperate poverty, and that our major export to those countries is weapons of one sort or another rather than productive economic aid, we are arming them to attack us. And that's really the crude reality of it. And so our security now really depends on the security of everyone else. It is linked to that. And it's very hard to change our way of thinking about that because it's deeply rooted over centuries and centuries of attitudes about what a nation is and what national security is, and that means we should be stronger than the other guy. And yet we really do, I think, in the modern world have to realize that we aren't separate and that our futures in some way are linked to the futures of these other countries. Not to be naive about the need to have an adequate military, that's not what we're talking about, but not to be naive about the different terms in which strength occurs in these days and in which national security also occurs. Now this year we've also been faced by another internal threat to the health and productivity of our people related to the nuclear arms race, and that has to do with the nuclear weapons production facilities. I'm sure that you've all been following in the news this incredible disclosure day after day since last August, really, of information about health and safety hazards at 17 different sites throughout the country, one of them Hanford right here in the Pacific Northwest, which was one of the first places where physicians and other concerned environmentalists increasingly put pressure on the governments to say, we need that health information about the releases of radioactive material and about what's been going into the air, into the ground, etc. What we're finding, not surprisingly, is that the push for production of plutonium, highly enriched uranium, and tritium to build nuclear weapons has eclipsed concern for the health of workers and the health of the communities around them. This is happening at a time when we're also realizing that we probably don't need any more of this stuff. If we're talking about 50% cuts in nuclear arsenals, there's lots of fuel in those weapons. There's varying estimates of how those could be recycled or reused. But certainly the threat to the health of our own citizens and the threat of the secrecy that's been posed and the distrust that it creates really is part of that internal infrastructure that begins to unravel if it's not taken more seriously. I think that that set of concerns is really going to be our major job then for the next at least couple of years, if not longer. PSR is growing in membership in an interesting way, and I think that this economic problem is really what gets to doctors more and more. Physicians all over the country are getting more and more frustrated by their inability to deliver high-quality medical care, about the cutbacks, about the people being left out of the system, about uninsured people who are uninsured because of either they don't get insurance with their jobs or they're out of work and therefore lose their insurance. And all of that creates a climate in which we have to realize that a burgeoning economy is essential to continued progress, not just in health and healthcare, but also in the other aspects of what makes our society strong. And so that's a basic first premise to continued growth in other areas. And we really need to do some serious analysis of how those things affect us. So let me then close, because I'm interested in hearing comments and questions from you. But I want to leave you with a quote from President Dwight Eisenhower, who realized this decades ago, really, 25 years ago, when he said the following: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. The world can either continue to pursue the arms race with characteristic vigor, or move consciously and with deliberate speed towards a more stable and balanced social and economic development within a more sustainable international economic and political order. It cannot do both." Thank you.
I'll remind everyone again that privileges of questions are reserved for members. There's a mic straight ahead, and our first question will be from our board host, James Harris.
Dr. Cassel, you talked a great deal about the USSR and the United States. To be honest with you, I am more concerned about countries like India, Pakistan, Israel, and to some degree or question Libya. So I guess my question is, what is PSR doing as far as, and you use the word world, how broad is your reach, and how are we reaching the third world nations, I guess?
You left South Africa out of that list. Among others, some estimates are that there are now up to 15 countries that have the capability to develop nuclear weapons, and over the next decade or so, that number will double. As I'm sure you've been reading lately, it's not just nuclear weapons that we're concerned about anymore. There's this thing that is cleverly referred to as the poor man's atom bomb, chemical weapons, and biological weapons of similar indiscriminate destructiveness, although perhaps not with the same effects on the environment. This problem of horizontal proliferation, I think, is a very important one for us to understand and to take seriously. Most reasonable people in the United States and in Russia assume that the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union are relatively rational people and would not intentionally start a nuclear war. Now, of course, if you go back and you read history about all of the relatively rational leaders of great powers in the past, you have to recognize that we can't necessarily assume that, but still, that is a widely held attitude, particularly these days, now that the Cold War is calming down a little bit. If we are to effectively limit the spread of these weapons to the rest of the world, the first step, the sine qua non of that, is for the superpowers to act responsibly in doing it. There is a 25-year-old non-proliferation treaty that the United Nations developed that long ago. There's some 117 signatories to that treaty. But the conditions of that treaty are that the superpowers will, number one, stop testing nuclear weapons and make good faith progress towards reducing their nuclear arsenals. And of course, look at it from the perspective of the so-called third world. As long as the superpowers aren't doing that and are saying to you, but we don't want you to have these weapons, then who's going to really take that seriously among the developing countries? And I think that's what's, particularly when we look at India and Pakistan and China and countries in South America that are developing nuclear capability, they can't imagine why they should not have nuclear weapons if the superpowers are continuing to build up their own arsenals. So our only hope to make the Non-Proliferation Treaty more effective is if the United States and the Soviet Union go along with the provisions of it. And in fact, there is a review conference for that treaty in 1990 and a renewal conference for that treaty in 1995. And my view is that if we haven't got a comprehensive test ban by that time, that the treaty will probably not be renewed, which would really be a serious problem. Now, there are, of course, nations that haven't signed that treaty, and Libya obviously is one of them. The only way that we can hope to have, there are two things we can do in the responsible sector of the world, which we consider ourselves, to help limit the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons by either a terrorist group or an irresponsible nation. One of those is to stop leaking and or selling plutonium, highly enriched uranium, and nuclear weapons fuels. Of all of the production reactors that are all over this country that we're now starting to look at, there is an amazing amount of, quote, lost materials, hundreds of pounds every year that are not accounted for and nobody knows where they went. But it's very clear that there are smuggling operations to get these weapons to countries that otherwise shouldn't have them. And secondly, we must continue our efforts to stigmatize, morally, and this is a real leadership question, morally stigmatize the ownership and use of these weapons so that at the very least we can globally create an attitude of great discrimination against a country that would actively use weapons like this. One of the things that will not help with the problem of terrorism or a nation such as Libya, I'm afraid, is SDI. It's been one of the supports for it is to say, well, it won't help in a major war with the Soviet Union, but at least we could intercept a terrorist missile and keep that from destroying Washington or New York. But of course, terrorist missiles aren't delivered on ICBMs, you know. They're delivered on boats, on pickup trucks, in suitcases, etc. And so the concept that SDI would somehow help prevent us from a terrorist attack is really a misunderstanding of the nature of modern nuclear weapons. So I think that that's a very important question. One of the reasons why the International Physicians Group has been, I think, such an important avenue, because we're able to deal with many of these international questions and not assume that this is necessarily just an issue between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yes, sir.
Richard Pope, member. I was wondering how you would answer those so-called rational minds in Washington and elsewhere who conclude that the only reason we are at peace and have been at peace since World War II, they say, is because of the presence of nuclear weapons.
We'll never know the answer to that question because we can't do a controlled experiment, isn't that right? There's not a parallel universe in which there weren't nuclear weapons, and therefore we saw whether further world wars so terrible as World War I and II developed. But that is a standard sort of common wisdom that, well, at least we haven't had another major world war, and what's happened instead is that we have these sort of proxy wars in the rest of the world that the United States and the Soviet Union sort of face off by proxy with other countries. That may be true, but nonetheless, regardless of whether it's true or not, it's not true that developing more nuclear weapons is going to make us more secure. And I think that's really where we need to realize that if we can, according to the recent estimates of the World Health Organization, kill every man, woman, and child on Earth 10 or 12 times over, that to add another 3 or 4 times to that is not going to enhance our ability to keep the peace such as it is.
If I can make a follow-up comment, I think historically it's true that since the days of bows and arrows, slingshots, and so forth, every time society has developed a new weapon, it has been used, and we're just waiting for that moment.
That's right.
You've rightfully said that security has a lot to do besides military weaponry, that health and the economy and all of those things. Shouldn't you be talking to us about conversion here that has been so much in military and educating us on how that conversion can take place to better our economy and our life and in so many ways?
I'd love to. Maybe I should come back next week. And I'm really actually seriously glad that you brought that up, because so much of our economy is now dependent on various aspects of this weapons production cycle and maintenance cycle, that it would be irresponsible of us not to understand the tens of thousands or millions of jobs that are dependent on this. We're having our annual conference this year at Stanford, right in the heart of Silicon Valley in the middle of March, where, as I was speaking to the editorial board of the newspaper in San Jose, they said that 1/3 of the jobs in that area are supported by SDI money. Not even just military in general, but specifically SDI. So when you start looking at cuts there, you're looking at serious business. When we go out to the Nevada test site, 30,000 jobs in Nevada are dependent directly on the continuing activity of nuclear weapons testing. So the only responsible way to talk about stopping these activities is to develop conversion strategies and diversification strategies. Many states are now doing that. And in fact, in Congress, there recently has been established a congressional commission on economic conversion and disarmament, which I'm privileged to sit on, along with a number of economists and people of expertise in other fields. And it's getting a lot of interest. There are 3 competing bills now in front of will be in front of Congress about federally supported conversion and diversification legislation. So Congress is getting ready for these cuts to occur, and we need to take that part of it seriously. We shouldn't be so hopeless about that. I mean, I keep reminding people, after World War II, we converted from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy quite efficiently and quite successfully, as a matter of fact, but it does take some intentional planning.
Paul Fishman, City Club member. First, I'd like to say you should have asked us how many of us own VCRs that were manufactured in the United States. This is actually sort of a follow-up to the previous question. My understanding is that to rebuild the plutonium and enriched uranium manufacturing facilities, we're talking about something like $250 billion over the next 20 years, perhaps, which I think is the same figure that the federal deficit is. Does PSR have any specific strategies or thoughts on how we can kind of wrestle this idea of rebuilding this machinery out of the minds of the people who are making those decisions? It seems to me that the track has started, perhaps a fast track, to get those decisions in place and get the thing rebuilt. And you've got some industries, some very large industries that are looking very eagerly at those contracts. Right. How do we go about getting that stopped?
Political activism is the answer to that question. Pressure on your elected representatives, because that really speaks louder than people realize. And that's how these other changes have begun to occur, particularly in a climate where people are concerned about the deficit. And now the figure that the $250 billion is now what they're beginning to talk about as the so-called cleanup cost for the existing weapons production facilities. Well, I was in Seattle yesterday talking with scientists there who say that that's even glib, because it's not at all clear that certain aspects of that toxicity can even be cleaned up at all at any price. And so when we see that cost, we shouldn't even we should realize that some of it perhaps can be cleaned up, but that the cost is extraordinary and some of it will never be able to be cleaned up. So those kinds of facts and public education about them, as well as about the cost of building these new facilities, really has to be done. It has to be done by groups like ours and by many parents groups and other concerned citizens groups who understand the economic implications as well as the implications for the threat of nuclear war, of rebuilding those facilities. I think we stand a pretty good chance of preventing that from happening, given the current economic environment in Congress, and also given the way in which what we've seen, that nobody in Congress trusts the DOE anymore. And they kept saying all through this year, they kept saying they had to start up the Savannah River reactor again because otherwise it was going to be unilateral disarmament if we didn't start it by, first it was December, now it was June, now it's next December. And what they're finding, of course, is that the safety hazards are so serious that it may never be able to be started up again. And in fact, every time you talk to one of them, they say, well, it's not exactly unilateral disarmament. Actually, this tritium might be able to last for 12 or maybe even 20 years. And so, you have to take every statement that is based on some scientific issue with a grain of salt and go to a number of sources and really see what they mean by that. So I think we're in a very good position to fight those things. I want to warn you, though, that they've asked for 2 new production facilities, one in Idaho and one in Savannah River, and that you always need to be suspicious when a federal agency asks for 2 of anything, because you know what they're really trying to get is 1. And they figure if they ask for 2, then they can compromise and settle on 1. And so we should be very careful not to settle on 1. And to make this message very clear, we do not need more of those toxic substances in this country at all, ever.
Ralph Crawshaw, member of the City Club. Chris, I'd like to tap into some of your insight and research into the motivation of physicians in this movement. In particular, you're postulating that the present commercialization of the medical profession will lead physicians to see that it would be wiser for them to participate in reducing the arms expenditure and put it into health. However, what we're seeing in actual changes within the medical profession is anything but that, but a very narrowing of their viewpoint as to their immediate survival. And a research project in which a survey was taken of the medical students on the Hill, and this will be reported at the Salishan Conference of the Multnomah County Medical Society tomorrow, is that they're very clearly materialistically oriented on a 9-to-5 basis to get what they can out of it. Isn't it asking a lot of logic to think that they would be more dedicated in that sense?
Well, all I can tell you is I travel around a lot and speak to physicians groups, and my personal experience is that even people who are very politically conservative in other ways and not likely to be what you would consider peaceniks or liberals are incredibly frustrated with even their limits to line their own pocketbooks, to get reimbursement for the services they provide. And it doesn't, and you know, these people are not dumb. It doesn't escape their attention that hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent on sheer madness, on things that are turned around the next day. I mean, the Pershing missiles in Europe, for example, in 1982, which were essential to our national security then, and put there at a cost of $9 billion, were dismantled with great fanfare under the INF Treaty suddenly just a few years later. So, you know, it doesn't take, I think that those arguments, if we can get to talk with physicians, often are very successful, and that's what I'm finding much, it's not that that their vision, it may be broad, or their commitment to world peace is so great, but that they really do see the connection economically, and that regardless of whether you think that's the right motivation or not, I'm finding that they're interested in this argument from that perspective.
Member Gilbert Lamb. Dr. Cassel, in your main speech, you made no reference to germ warfare. I think the answer to your first question, you did say a word or two about it. But isn't it true that with the potential for possible germ warfare and nuclear warfare, that the only answer is some form of international world government? If we had that and get rid of all munitions expenditures, think what we could do for the human race.
I have no argument. I think that, you know, those concepts are very important visionary concepts, and yet many people use, I guess I do have a comment, many people will use a vision like that as a way to say, oh, well, it's hopeless because we never can have world government, therefore we can never get rid of the threat of nuclear war or biological weapons. I think we have to operate on 2 planes at the same time. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King, who was able to provide leadership in a very concrete political way by integrating buses and by working with Congress, et cetera, and who also had a dream. And that dream some people may have said that's crazy, that's unrealistic, that's idealistic, but he was able to do both. And perhaps we need to think of ourselves in both operating on parallel tracks in order to see beyond the political obstacles that we face every day.
We do have a couple of written questions before we close here. You mentioned that PSR is concerned about diversion of resources away from such basic human needs as health care. To what extent is your organization taking the lead on providing that health care and lobbying for that as a trade-off, a direct trade-off at reducing weapons production?
That hasn't, health care issues per se have not been part of the official policy concerns of PSR. And yet, many of our members obviously are very active in their own organizations. I, for example, as part of the American College of Physicians, the Society of General and Internal Medicine, and a new organization, Physicians for a National Health Program, work for those arenas. So I think we can't, even though our name, Physicians for Social Responsibility, is a broad one, we find that our effectiveness is greater if we focus our political efforts in one particular arena. But it doesn't mean that the members of the organization don't work then for those changes in other fields.
And as a last question, Congress is really driven by, or I should say each congressman is driven by what goes on in their own district, especially when it comes to money and economics. Do you really see a shift, an interesting shift by local congresspeople of actually closing down, shutting down, or removing from their districts defense projects that have been longtime employers, providing for the economy in the local districts in favor of some other kind of activity? Doesn't this threaten these local congresspeople with not being reelected, God forbid?
Yeah, that's a big problem in those areas where there are major pork barrel or military or other kinds of projects in which a lot of citizens work. And that's why diversification and conversion legislation on a federal level is so important, because we can't underestimate the political realities of that. But let me also point out to you that those same local political realities are what has created the pressures on Congress to make the progress that we have been able to make, that places where there are very active disarmament and arms control citizens groups, for example, put the same pressure on those congressmen, and they'll tell you that. I mean, when I go to Washington, the congressmen who are elected out of states and districts which have very articulate and concerned and persistent citizens activist groups respond to those groups, and so it works both ways. And that's why politics is so particular, and why you have to look at each elected official and find out what really are the interests behind that person in getting that person elected. And it's one of the most sort of effective aspects of our lobbying effort in Washington is that we have these 155 chapters all over the country, each of which is very well informed about its own political milieu and about its own elected representatives, and can be much more effective than we can be from the national perspective in accomplishing some of that change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cassel, and we appreciate you taking the time. I'd like to invite all of you back to the Hilton next week for a presentation on the Olympics, and we are adjourned.